richest. A prize piece in the board game of international rivalry which had yet to descend into the carnage of the First World War. Her splendor was dazzling, even in the glory of early 20th century affluence. On May the 1st, 1915, nearly 2,000 passengers and crew would alight upon the decks of the LUSITANIA in ignorance or denial of their own peril. In the war to end all wars, the Atlantic had become a deadly chessboard, and the Royal Merchant ship Lusitania a pawn of the armed powers. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Western world still held dear the notion that war could be waged by gentlemen, in command of neatly uniformed soldiers, lining up in flawless formation. On the seas, the image of grand Nelsonian naval battles still lingered, with proud admirals, gallant even in defeat, surrendering their colors and swords to their victorious opponents. Perhaps these perceptions were so comforting because the reality was not. The American Civil War had shown that starving an entire population into submission was a surer winning strategy than battlefield victories. Though even soldiers were loath to admit it, warfare had changed forever. With the advent of new and deadlier weapons, it was about to change again.
I can see it now. I can sit here now and visualize that liner coming around the corner, watching her sailing up there, and then there's this explosion, and the whole tragedy happened.
So many people were lost and there was so much confusion. My mother had a very rough life afterwards. She used to wake up in the middle of the night thinking she was going down with the ship.
Anybody who was on it, you never forget it. I mean, you don't, what should I say? It's always with you.
The torpedoing of the passenger liner RMS Lusitania off the coast of Ireland on May the 7th, 1915, would drive home to the world the truth of war that it would be so much better not to know. The image of innocent men, women, and children floating lifeless in a freezing sea. The Lusitania story begins with a rivalry. For over 100 years, the small islands which made up the nation of Great Britain had boasted that they ruled the waves. Then, in the late 19th century, the formerly weak collection of independent states that had been Germany discovered a new power in unity. Under the uncompromising leadership of Kaiser Wilhelm, the fledgling nation began to take to the sea.
German commerce, German national identity, and German imperialism all ballooned during the late 19th century to the consternation of Britain. The Germans were a brand new nation. They were only about 40 years old at the turn of the century, and they were going to make their mark on absolutely everything that there was, including shipping.
Spurred on by the Kaiser, himself a keen seaman, whose undisguised ambition was to wrest control of the waves from the British, German engineers proceeded to design a new fleet of technically superior passenger liners, built for speed as well as for luxury. Palatial steamers like the Kaiser Wilhelm de Gross soon captured the coveted blue ribbon for the fastest Atlantic crossing. To add insult to injury for the British Empire, in 1902, American millionaire J. Pierpont Morgan acquired control of the White Star Line. With White Star in American hands, the British Admiralty could no longer count on being able to commandeer its vessels should they be needed in time of war. It was clear to both the Admiralty and the Cunard shipping line that they needed to take immediate action in order to reclaim Britannia's lost honor on the waves and to ensure her future safety. In this climate of intense national competition, two technologically superior superliners were first conceived. Lusitania, named after the former Roman province that is now Portugal, and her sister Mauritania, named after the North African Roman province, were funded by a parliamentary loan of £2,600,000 to Cunard, in a bargain with the Admiralty that guaranteed their immediate conversion to armed auxiliary cruisers in time of war. In 1904, Lusitania's first keel plate was laid at the John Brown shipyard at Clydebank in Scotland.
It took them a full 3 years to come up with plans and specifications. Most ships are only designed in a fraction of that time. Almost every feature on the Lusitania was new or innovative by necessity because they were out to beat the Germans. The most breathtaking thing about her was her engines. This was the first time that steam turbine engines had been put in a large merchant ship. Up to that point, turbines were experimental.
785 feet long, with the displacement of over 40,000 tons, Lusitania was designed to reach a speed of 25 knots. She was outfitted with state-of-the-art safety features, including 34 watertight compartments, divided by hydraulically powered doors controlled from the bridge at the flick of a switch. On the 7th of June 1906, more than 20,000 people crowded in Lusitania's towering shadow to witness her christening. Murmurs of patriotic approval rippled through the crowd. Surely this grand behemoth would reaffirm Britannia's maritime prowess. It would be another year before the pride of the Cunard Line was fully outfitted and ready to leave Liverpool on her maiden voyage in September 1907. After years of anticipation and reams of promotional build-up, Lusitania's arrival in New York Harbor spawned a press frenzy.
Britain, of course, was thrilled to have a Greyhound back in their stables. America was secretly rooting for the British also. There was the common bonds of language and nationality, and the Germans were starting to get just a little puffed up for American tastes. So when the Lusitania came out, for weeks before and after, you couldn't pick up the paper without major photo spreads.
Lusitania set a new transatlantic record on her second crossing, Liverpool to New York in under 5 days. The Cunarder triumphantly took back the blue ribbon from a bitterly humiliated Germany. The following month, her sister Mauritania departed on her maiden voyage, soon to set yet another record for a 24-knot crossing. In addition to speed and safety, there were passenger comforts to be considered. The German liners had enticed the Americans away from the practical British ships, with their opulence and distinctly continental flavor. Cunard designed its swift and sleek sisters to be the new glamour queens of the Atlantic.
The Mauritania and the Lusitania were the very finest, the acme of SWAT, I might say. They had very, very elegant cabins, finest under the sun. No hotel in the world would give you a better cabin or a better room. And then you would mill around in a magnificent lounge filled with oil paintings.
Open-air verandas on deck, elaborate green-veined marble fireplaces crowned by ornate bas-reliefs, even a wrought-iron lift to carry tired passengers weighed down by 5 days of first-class food. These were the features designed to convince the wealthiest of transatlantic clients to cross with the Lusitania.
It was transforming a magnificent hotel from the middle of London, the very finest hotel you could possibly think of, to sea.
Even at sea, the rigid class distinctions of the Edwardian era held firm. For every deluxe first-class suite for a Vanderbilt or a Rockefeller, there were cozy but less ornate berths for those traveling second class. And simpler accommodation for those in steerage, though many were surprised at the level of comfort even on the lower decks.
On the Lusitania, they were offered a lot of amenities they had basically no idea existed. It was their first contact with hot and fresh running water, hot and cold air on demands in staterooms. One passenger told me that he had his first drink of cold refrigerated milk on the ship.
For nearly 4 years, the Lucy and the Maury would rule as the queens of the North Atlantic seas. The mighty siblings were not long without rivals. In April 1912, White Star's RMS Titanic made the last stop of her maiden voyage at Queenstown, Ireland, then sailed off into history, sinking less than 3 hours after hitting an iceberg and taking to the bottom over 1,500 people because there weren't enough lifeboats to hold them. The world received the news in stunned disbelief. Titanic's sinking sent a shiver of warning throughout every major merchant fleet, and the Cunard line was no exception.
When the Titanic sank, many changes were immediately adopted, and one of them was the addition of lifeboat space for every soul on board a ship, not just enough so that it seemed safe, but enough to absolutely cover all the bases, and everyone was now protected.
Now fortified with a total of 48 lifeboats each, the Cunard sisters continued their lucrative voyages between Liverpool and New York. Meanwhile, throughout the winter of 1913, the tensions between Germany and her European neighbours had been steadily mounting. In Parliament, fears mounted that the crisis in the Balkans could escalate into armed conflict, and plans were laid. On the 17th of March 1914, only 4.5 months before war broke out, Winston Churchill, then the 40-year-old First Lord of the Admiralty, announced publicly that 40 merchantmen had already been defensively armed. By the spring of 1915, Churchill proclaimed other first-class liners would also be fortified for war. These liners included Lusitania and Mauretania. Cunard had struck a £2,600,000 deal with the government in order to build their lucrative super ships. Now that debt was coming due. Would the Admiralty order the world's most luxurious liner to be turned into a high-speed warship?
If you'd like to know more.
For 7 years, Royal Merchant Ship Lusitania had had unprecedented success, while the Western world enjoyed the wealth which had built up in 100 years of peace. Then, in June 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian throne, lit the fuse which was to plunge Europe into violence. In August, the Germans invaded Belgium, in clear violation of all international law. Britain and France responded by declaring war on Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany. First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill immediately pressed his auxiliary merchant cruisers into service. It seemed as if Lusitania's days of opulent leisure were about to come to an end. She was fitted for mounts for powerful 6-inch guns, as outlined in her original design plans. But when naval experts weighed her pros and cons as a weapon of war, they began to voice doubts.
When the Lusitania was originally conceived, she was going to be an armed merchant cruiser, basically a flyweight battleship with no armament, great speed, and moderate-sized guns. The British Navy was thinking twice, do we really want these lightweight, unarmored ships flying around? They'll get a few lucky shots in, but they'll probably be lost at the first exchange of serious gunplay.
With their high-tech turbine engines, Lusitania and her sister Mauretania gobbled a huge amount of coal, something no nation at war could justify even in an armed merchantman. It seemed the British government had invested in the Western world's most expensive seagoing white elephants. And there were voices of warning from within the British Empire as well. On the 14th of May 1914, Admiral Lord Fisher complained, "The recent arming of our British ships is unfortunate, for it gives a hostile submarine an excellent excuse, if she needs one, for sinking them." The Admiralty decided on a cost-effective solution: to convert Mauretania into a troop transport. Her sister Lusitania, ever the dependable backbone of the Cunard Line, maintained her transatlantic passenger service between New York and Liverpool. The luxury liner seemed to have won a reprieve. It would be business as usual, war or no war. In the meantime, the British North Sea Fleet prepared for a quick strike victory over the German upstarts.
Britain's belief was that the embryonic German navy, this new navy that had its origins back in 1890, would charge out to a great sea battle, which Churchill was very confident of winning. Britain had the finest navy in the whole world. They had 400 years of victory behind them. There would be a great battle of glory, and the war would be over in 4 weeks. Germany realized that whilst it had a very modern navy, it was only half the size of the Grand Fleet. And they decided they would not expose themselves by sailing out to slaughter and doom, which would be the case. And then the war began to bog down. Other means had to be found then to achieve victory.
Despite the blustery confidence of generals on both sides of the conflict, everything about this 20th century war was strange and perplexing. The high-tech brutality of trench warfare, armored tanks, aeroplanes, mustard gas, all contributed to create a front where thousands of fresh-faced boys could be wiped out in a single barrage. On the seas, there was other threatening new technology. Slowly at first, submarines had been introduced into the conflict.
When submarines and airplanes were first introduced, they were toys. They had absolutely no idea how they were going to be used. As the technology developed, strategies and techniques developed simultaneously. So instead of just being used for passive reconnaissance, you started seeing submarines and airplanes being used in an aggressive fashion.
To England, Empress of the Oceans, The underwater threat of the submarines seemed as outlandish as any H.G. Wells fantasy. The British Admiralty chose another strategy to ensure their victory over the enemy. Relying on their well-armed North Sea fleet, they instituted a full-scale blockade of Germany.
It effectively linked a chain right through Britain up as far as Norway, a chain of warships and minefields, and it bottled up all shipping. An effect of that blockade very soon was to impose hunger and famine on the civilian population.
The British blockade enraged neutral nations like Denmark, Sweden and Norway, whose merchant ships had to submit to time-consuming detours and contraband searches. Their leaders implored America to join them in protest, but the most the United States government offered was an ineffective flurry of angry letters. While President Woodrow Wilson and his cabinet were determined to stay out of the war, in the time-honored tradition of American capitalism, they were quick to seize upon an obvious economic opportunity, selling arms to Britain and Germany. Peacetime factories hurriedly converted their equipment for the making of munitions. Assembly lines provided millions of jobs, as American men and women churned out bullets, mortars, and guns. Due to the success of their blockade, the British were usually the recipients of American weaponry, while the frustrated Germans could only cry favoritism. By the early months of 1915, the British starvation blockade was doing its deadly job. On the 4th of February, Germany announced a plan of retaliation, declaring the waters around Great Britain a war zone, in which all Allied ships would be sunk without warning. Britain would now feel the effects of a U-boat blockade.
Basically, Britain forced Germany into this position because their citizens were starving. Germany had to do something, and the U-boat was the only way they could retaliate.
Grand Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, head of the German Navy, unleashed his fleet of U-boats with a devastating effect on merchant shipping, but relatively little loss of civilian life. This was due to Germany's adherence to the cruiser rules that had dominated warfare on the waves for hundreds of years.
Cruiser rules were kind of a leftover from when you had gentlemen's wars. The idea was that a military force would not attack a civilian population without fair warning for escape or surrender. So in the very first days of the First World War, submarines would surface. Somebody would come up with a bullhorn, announce intentions. Sometimes the ship would be searched and let go. If the commander of the U-boat did not like what the ship was carrying, then the ship would be evacuated and sunk.
The laws were followed to the letter by the Germans in the early weeks of the war. And Churchill observed this trait and hatched a plot whereby he could bend the rules a bit and sink more submarines.
Churchill assembled his fleet of Q-boats, armed cruisers disguised as merchantmen, to lure unsuspecting German subs into battle. He then issued a top-secret directive to all merchant commanders, when confronted with a U-boat, to turn bow first at full speed, to ram the fragile underwater craft and send it to the bottom.
The Germans lost 11 U-boats to this misuse of cruiser rules before they cottoned on to Churchill's tricks. The Germans soon learned that you had to shoot first and ask questions afterwards.
As warfare on the Atlantic escalated into a dizzying exchange of strategies, Lusitania continued her Liverpool to New York runs on a reduced schedule of only one round-trip crossing per month. Perhaps her passengers were lulled into complacency by President Wilson's stern words to the Germans once he learned of their new policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. Wilson wrote, "In pursuance of strict accountability, the United States will take any steps necessary to safeguard American lives and property."
President Wilson had the feeling that if you were an American, you could travel anywhere in the world with immunity. He was especially fanatical, for lack of a better word, about Americans' rights to travel on the open seas. Basically, what he was telling Americans is, you can board belligerent ships that are involved in the war, that are carrying munitions, and you can act as shields, because Germany wouldn't dare torpedo a ship that carried Americans.
Lusitania's master, Captain Daniel Dow, was not so confident. He had narrowly escaped one close encounter with a U-boat by using the highly controversial ruse of flying an American flag instead of the Union Jack, another of Churchill's top-secret ploys for protecting his merchant ships at sea. In mid-March 1915, Dow resigned his post upon reaching home port in Liverpool.
There are no first-hand accounts of why Captain Dow left, but rumor had it that he was basically stressed out. The stress of commanding the Lusitania, such a large, important passenger ship, through the war zone for so many months, had finally taken its toll, and he needed just to get out.
Cunard gave command of Lusitania to the pre-war master of the Mauretania, Captain William Turner.
Captain Turner had been with Cunard for about 40 years. He was a very tried and true sailor. Cunard had full confidence in him. The only thing that I would consider perhaps a weakness in his character, and it really goes for anyone, is that he was set in his ways. He had been sailing the same route from Liverpool to Queenstown to New York and back for 40 years.
Consistent with his spotless Cunard record, Turner successfully piloted the Lusitania from England to New York in mid-April. On May the 1st, with nearly 2,000 people aboard, he would embark on the Lusitania's infamous final crossing. The United States seemed virtually untouched by the carnage overseas in April 1915. Despite large numbers of German and European immigrants, despite the admonitions of war hawks like former President Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson was determined to keep America out of the war. New York, as always, was a bustling center of commerce and trade. The city's docks were crowded with merchant ships waiting to ferry munitions and supplies to the European front. Among those ships was the Cunard Line's Lusitania. Now under the command of Captain William Turner, the mammoth liner had arrived from Liverpool on April the 24th. In a few days she was scheduled to depart on her 202nd crossing of the Atlantic. To the delight of Cunard Line accountants, their strategy of reducing transatlantic fares had resulted in over 1,200 bookings for the voyage, by far the largest number of passengers since the beginning of the war. Perhaps people would not have been so eager to travel aboard a British liner had they known how well the Germans were doing in their submarine assault on ships traveling on the western approaches to Britain, the Lusitania's scheduled route. In Ireland, fishermen and coastal residents watched with fear and fascination as the sea war unfolded just off their shores. George Henderson was then a curious 5-year-old from Bandon, County Cork.
There were quite a few destroyers and warships around that way, and on one or two occasions we saw a bit of a battle going on in the bay against submarines and so on. Some of the fishermen there made quite a living out of it. You would see them going out in little rowing boats, loaded up with petrol and all sorts of things, and they used to supply the submarine crews.
By April 1915, the mighty Royal Navy found itself woefully short-handed in its battle against the U-boat menace, with the majority of its armed cruisers embroiled in the blockade or waylaid by the disastrous campaign in the Dardanelles. Back in New York, the Lusitania was being readied for her departure. Among those taking interest in her voyage was the German ambassador to Washington, Count Johann Bernstorff. Bernstorff, along with German-American members of the propaganda cabinet in New York, had become increasingly anxious that an accidental encounter in the North Atlantic might result in American deaths and a backlash against the fatherland. They decided to place a warning in various American newspapers. The advertisement ran on May the 1st, the day the Lusitania was scheduled to depart for England. It warned all passengers planning to cross the Atlantic on a belligerent vessel that they were doing so at their own risk. Whether due to Wilson's speeches about American immunity, or to the cherished belief that the swift Lusitania with her powerful turbine engines could easily outrun any pursuing submarine, this dire warning attracted little attention as a steady flow of passengers arrived at Pier 54.
By the time the newspapers came out, most of the passengers had already boarded the ship and they didn't see the warning. Most people, even if they had seen the warning, would not have canceled because they thought the Lusitania was invincible.
Still, rumors persisted. Margaret Cox and her 17-month-old son Desmond were returning home to Britain from Canada and traveling second class.
When my mother got to the Cunard booking office, the girl in the office said to her, "Now, aren't you afraid to go on this voyage?" And she said, "Well, why should I be?" And she said, "Well, all the warnings about the possibility of the Lusitania being torpedoed. You see, there were lots of warnings, and people just didn't take them seriously."
Among the more famous passengers traveling on Lusitania's 202nd voyage was theatre impresario Charles Frohman. Frohman, on his way to London to see the newest crop of British plays, scoffed at a warning sent to him on the ship. Alfred Vanderbilt, the millionaire sportsman, was also bound for England to attend a horse breeders' convention. He too dismissed a hand-delivered warning as a joke in poor taste. No stranger to transatlantic travel, the 37-year-old playboy believed in his own unbroken streak of luck. 5 years earlier, he had been scheduled to travel aboard the ill-fated Titanic, but had cancelled at the last minute. Like many other first-class passengers, Frohman and Vanderbilt were traveling on a belligerent ship during wartime when they need not have traveled, or could have done so in safety. They could have crossed on a truly neutral American liner like the New York, which departed the harbor an hour before the Lusitania was scheduled to leave. Both men, and others of their social set, refused to forego the prestige of taking their usual deluxe cabins on the Grand Lusitania. The passengers may have worried more had they known what was being loaded into Lusitania's cargo hold, including 4,200 cases of Remington rifle cartridges and 1,271 cases of non-explosive fuses and shrapnel shells.
It's been known for decades that the Lusitania carried munitions on her final voyage. There were actually two manifests that were presented to clear the ship. One was presented the day before she left New York on April 30th. It was a one-page manifest with nondescript items, cheese, beef, bacon, things like that. 5 days later, on May 5th, a supplementary manifest was presented, and all the munitions were listed on that manifest.
The cargo, as listed, fell under the category of small arms ammunition, which since 1911 had been perfectly legal to carry aboard passenger steamers. So why was Cunard issuing an incomplete manifest? It was a question that would come back to haunt everyone connected with the liner. On the morning of May the 1st, 1915, Captain Turner stepped onto the bridge of his new command. Only the day before, he had given testimony as an expert witness for the Titanic liability hearings. When asked if he had learned anything from the legendary liner's fatal collision with an iceberg, the old captain had growled, "Not the slightest. It will happen again." At 12:30 p.m., the 30,000-ton Lusitania departed New York for the last time. With fluttering handkerchiefs, travelers bid farewell to friends and loved ones gathered along the docks.
I remember being on the deck and seeing the people waving goodbye down below. Dad wasn't any different than he always was. I mean, he didn't strike me as being nervous or anything like that. The whole point was the people were just saying goodbye, so we all waved goodbye. I mean, there wasn't any talk about any danger of sailing in the Lusitania, none at all.
Only a day earlier, some 3,000 miles east, the German submarine U-20, under the command of Lieutenant Walter Schweiger, had glided stealthily out of the port of Emden on Germany's north coast, bound for Liverpool. His orders were clear and to the point: seek out and destroy British and Allied shipping. That directive included the RMS Lusitania. On May the 2nd, 1915, Lusitania was steaming gracefully through the swells of the North Atlantic en route to Liverpool. Just a day out of New York, the ship had been blessed with clear skies and calm seas. The bloody trenches in Europe and the twisted wrecks of British merchant ships on the ocean floor below them did not exist for passengers who diverted themselves with the liner's bountiful luxuries. Five-year-old Edith Lewis was returning to England with her family so that her father could join the war effort.
I had good fun playing on the deck with a little girl my own age. I don't remember her name now, I don't even remember that. But she and I were inseparable on the trip, although we played together all the time.
10-year-old Frank Hook was traveling from Canada with his sister Elsie and their father.
Oh, yeah, but my father and I used to get up early in the morning. At that early age, you could walk all over the sea.
The boys on the ship found out that there was girls doing Swedish exercises, and they used to go and watch them. They thought it was fun to go and watch the girls doing their exercises.
My sister couldn't touch her ankles.
Your sister couldn't touch her ankles?
No. Supposed to touch her feet. He couldn't. So big and fat.
17-month-old Des Cox spent the better part of the voyage at the side of his mother, Margaret.
My mother was 27 when she was on board, and she was an attractive woman. And, she had all sorts of offers for dancing and card games and all this sort of stuff. But, no, she looked after me, first and foremost.
But in contrast to the carefree disposition of the passengers, morale among Lusitania's crew was low.
First of all, who would want to be sailing on a ship through a war zone with the chance of being torpedoed? It was very hard to get crew members who would do that. In fact, when Lusitania reached New York for the last time, a lot of the crew actually deserted. So they had to recruit crew on the wharf the morning she sailed.
An ocean away from the Lusitania, the crew of the German submarine U-20 had left their home port of Emden with high spirits, in expectations of a successful mission. Under the command of 30-year-old Lieutenant Walter Schweiger, U-20's men were elated to be heading for the North Atlantic, a seemingly infinite expanse of ocean rife with enemy ships. On May the 5th, near the old head of Kinsale, Ireland, the U-20 encountered the 132-ton Earl of Latham, a schooner out of Liverpool. Upon determining that the unarmed craft was of no danger to his U-boat, Schweiger decided to honor cruiser rules, allowing the small crew to abandon ship before sending their vessel to the bottom. The Earl of Latham would be the last vessel towards which Schweiger would display such courtesy. The following day, May the 6th, U-20's methodical assaults on Allied shipping continued, and she sank 2 steamers directly in the path of the approaching Lusitania. While no specific word of these sinkings was reported to Captain Turner, he had already taken the precaution of having the ship's lifeboats swung out, ready for lowering, and ordered a partial blackout of the ship at nightfall. Still citing the ship's speed and state-of-the-art safety features as her natural defenses, he ignored several passengers' requests for lifeboat drill.
There was one passenger who expressed grave concerns during the crossing that something would happen and they needed to get the passengers prepared. He was so forceful in what he said that a contingent of male passengers came up to him later on during the day and said, "You must stop this, you're scaring the ladies."
On that same evening, Captain Turner received the first of 10 wireless messages from the British Admiralty. Submarines active off south coast of Ireland.
The British Admiralty never advised Turner specifically 2 ships were lost to U-boat attacks in your vicinity, take extra measures. Instead, they simply sent out the repeated vague warnings that Turner had been seeing for weeks now.
At the ship's concert on the evening of May the 6th, Turner assured his passengers that he would steam at full speed the next day to arrive at Liverpool in time to make the afternoon high tide. With her windows and portholes blacked out, the Lusitania was virtually invisible as she sailed through the night, taking the same course she had successfully navigated 100 times before. On the morning of May the 7th, Lusitania found herself buried in patches of murky fog, forcing Captain Turner to reduce her speed from 21 to 15 knots. In an effort to spot German submarines, Turner ordered extra lookouts posted on the ship's forecastle and stationed a quartermaster on either side of the bridge. The Lusitania was now less than 100 miles from the coast of Ireland. By mid-morning, the fog had burned away, and passengers wandered to the upper decks to delight in an idyllically sunny spring day. Lusitania was now in a war zone declared by Germany, and Captain Turner was fully expected to follow the Admiralty's directives for travel in submarine-infested waters. To steer a mid-channel course, staying clear of headlands, known hunting grounds for waiting U-boats, to power his vessel with maximum speed, and to use an evasive navigation maneuver known as zigzagging, making it nearly impossible for a direct torpedo hit. Turner failed to implement any of these orders consistently.
Captain Turner's attitude during his command of the Lusitania's final voyage was pretty much lax because, again, he was an old sea dog, and he knew best, and he resented being told what to do by these young whippersnappers in the Admiralty who think they have all the answers to everything.
At 1 p.m., Lusitania received one last message from the Admiralty, which read, "Submarines 5 miles south of Cape Clear, proceeding west when sighted at 10 a.m." Cape Clear was 20 miles astern of Lusitania. Perhaps this information gave Captain Turner the mistaken impression that his vessel had passed unscathed through the danger zone. For his next decisions have proven some of the most controversial in maritime history.
He maneuvered the Lusitania to parallel the Irish coast, and once he sighted land, slowed down in order to take a 4-point bearing. This entails having the ship travel in the fatal straight line for a long period of time, while the navigators check the progression of landmarks and establish the exact position of the ship on the water and her exact speed.
He couldn't conceive of his ship being sunk, and so he paid no attention to the threat of submarines and turned her this way and that to adjust the compasses, and she was a sitting duck.
The breathtaking view of the Irish coast 12 miles away, coupled with sunny skies, delighted the passengers who felt that they were near the end of their voyage.
They were very excited because Ireland was in view. A lot of the Irish passengers standing on deck pointing out, "Oh, well, there's that, and there's that, and oh, well, that's where I was born." The diary entry says, "Thank God for a safe journey, we can see Ireland now."
On the shores of Kinsale, under the towering shadow of the ancient lighthouse, then 5-year-old George Henderson was picnicking with his father and brothers.
It was a lovely day. The sun was shining. It was just one of those calm days where you could stand there and just look out to sea and see whatever was passing. We were standing at the cliff edge, and my father suddenly said, "Oh, look!" And he pointed out at this big liner coming around the point into Courtmacsherry Bay. We had no idea what it was, and we just saw it steaming up there, massive liner. It was one of the biggest structures I'd ever seen.
From the shore, no one could see the German submarine bobbing on the gentle swells of the Irish Sea. Low on fuel, provisions, and torpedoes, the U-20 was already heading home after a successful hunting trip. At 1:20 p.m., Lieutenant Walter Schweiger spotted 4 funnels off his starboard bow 13 miles away. Recognizing the vessel as a large passenger steamer that appeared to be flying no flags, he immediately submerged and made for the distant vessel at a speed of 9 knots. As the U-20 closed on the liner, Schweiger knew he had only one hope for a clean shot: if the mammoth steamer made a starboard turn. As if in answer to his prayers, at 1:40 p.m. the 4-funneled ship turned to starboard. Schweiger now had a 30,000-ton target directly in his sights. Shortly after 2 p.m., he gave the order to fire one of U-20's torpedoes. "18-year-old Leslie N. Morton, an inexperienced lookout, was perched on the starboard bow when he saw the foaming streak racing through the waves towards his vessel. For unknown reasons, Captain Turner had left the bridge 10 minutes earlier to go to his cabin. He came running back when he heard the officer of the watch cry out. Turner was too late. The U-20's torpedo was only seconds away from RMS Lusitania's starboard bow.
If you'd like to know more about the
On a sunny afternoon on May the 7th, 1915, despite the warning cries from the lookout of the British liner Lusitania, most of her passengers and crew were unaware that a TNT-filled German torpedo was streaking through the Irish Sea towards the starboard bow of their ship. Five-year-old Edith Lewis and her family were just sitting down to lunch.
I was down in the dining room for the second luncheon waiting for my chicken sandwich because I hadn't been well, and Mother had ordered a chicken sandwich for me, and we were waiting for it to come, and then there was this big bang.
When the torpedo hit, dishes were flying all over and people were actually knocked out of their chairs.
Standing on the shore of the old head of Kinsale, young George Henderson watched in awe as the explosion rocked the great ship, sending a geyser of wood, twisted metal and seawater over 100 feet into the air.
You could see some hitting the bows. My father, I think, said, "Oh, that's obviously a submarine." As a 6-year-old boy, I was fascinated. I'd never seen anything like this in my life before. I just wondered what was going to happen. Quickly following, there was another explosion, which we thought was another torpedo.
Some 700 meters away, U-20's commander, Lieutenant Walter Schweiger, watched in astonishment as the massive liner began to plow bow first into the ocean. Was it possible, Schweiger wondered, that this single torpedo could have inflicted such a wound in the mammoth liner, or cause a second, more powerful explosion? Later, he wrote in his logbook, "Since it seemed as if the steamer would keep above water only a short time, we dived to a depth of 24 meters and ran out to sea. It would have been impossible for me anyhow to fire a second torpedo into this crowd of people struggling to save their lives." On board Lusitania, tons of seawater rushed in through the gaping hole caused by the mysterious second explosion, and through portholes opened to let in the spring air. As a result, hundreds of passengers and crew were trapped in darkness below the sinking liner's decks.
Most people, believe it or not, didn't even realize that they had been struck by a torpedo. Panic ensued, people running all over the place.
Dad grabbed me and they made for the companionway, and I had hold of Mother's hair, because Mother had hair down here and all the pins flew out, and I had hold of her hair and Dad was carrying me.
Caught in the midst of this terror and turmoil were young Des Cox and his mother Margaret.
My mother was almost carried up the stairs. There were so many people crowding the stairs. And one of the sad things she noticed when she was going up was a lift or elevator full of people trapped. The power had gone off. There was no way they were just like rats in a cage.
Up top, the vessel's 22 lifeboat stations were scenes of pandemonium as frantic men, women and children scrambled across Lusitania's listing decks towards the crafts they believed would be their salvation.
The ship was sloping on the starboard side. Water was virtually lapping on the bow. My mother, carrying me, went to the port side first, which was the high side. But they were having a lot of trouble with the lifeboats there. Most of them were crashing.
All the port boats swung inboard, so you would have 65, 70 people in these lifeboats and the crew trying to launch them. Well, the boats weigh 5 tons by themselves, and with a list of 15 degrees, the crew had to try to push the boats uphill over the side of the ship. The boats fell inboard against the superstructure and scythed their way through crowds on deck, killing and mutilating dozens of people.
While passengers converged on the lifeboat stations, Captain Turner attempted to turn Lusitania towards the nearby Irish shore, hoping he'd have time to beach her in shallow water. Those hopes were dashed when the ship lost all power. Nevertheless, Lusitania's wireless operator had managed to punch out an SOS. Come at once. Strong list. Position 10 miles south Kinsale. That message was received in Queenstown, 25 miles away.
Rumours spread like wildfire through the town, ranging from the possibility that the Lusitania had been hit but only slightly damaged, and in fact for a while people genuinely thought she was being towed into port and that they'd see her coming into the harbour. Nobody really knew exactly what was happening.
The reality was that with each passing second, more water flooded the lower decks. Lusitania was sinking faster than anyone could have imagined. Meanwhile, on the ship's upper decks, the disorganized evacuation was having dire consequences.
First of all, they said women and children only, and then they changed it to married men, women and children. And so we did get into the lifeboat, and the one boat that we were in, the blocks stuck, and they borrowed Dad's penknife to cut the falls. And of course we dropped into the water, and the boat was packed, and we rowed like mad to get away from the ship as she was sinking.
Even amidst the madness that enveloped the ship, several passengers were patiently helping others instead of saving themselves. Millionaire Alfred Vanderbilt passed out life jackets to women and children, despite the fact that he himself was unable to swim. As a result of his altruism, Vanderbilt never made it to the lifeboats. Many were prematurely cut loose, hurtling hundreds of passengers, mostly without life jackets, some 40 feet into the churning seas below. Other boats came crashing down on crafts already in the water, crushing their occupants. Among those pressing to find a space aboard one of the remaining lifeboats on the starboard side were Desmond Cox and his mother.
The list was so great that everybody was falling. And she said to somebody, "Don't bother about me, take the boy." But I was thrown in and then she got in. This was the last lifeboat that was successfully launched.
When it became apparent that many of the remaining lifeboats were useless, people began jumping from the liner's decks into the ocean. Desperate mothers lashed themselves to their children before making the leap. One of Lusitania's most famous passengers, theatre impresario Charles Frohman, was still trapped on board. In the midst of all the chaos, Frohman calmly quoted from his favorite play, Peter Pan, "To die will be an awfully big adventure." In the confusion on board, 10-year-old Frank Hook became separated from his father and sister, but found his own way off the mortally wounded liner.
I understand from what Dad has said that he went hand in hand down the rope, down the side of the boat, and then the water was all churned up and a big wave hit him, and he was tossed around like a rag doll. Then when he came up out of the water, there happened to be, not far away, a boat turned upside down, and there was a man on board that saw him and started to pull him in.
In surreal contrast to the panicking masses aboard her, the proud liner seemed almost graceful in her death throes.
She looked beautiful. I mean, the sun was shining brilliantly, and she was on her side, of course, slightly tilted. But before she went down, as I remember it, she slightly righted herself a little bit.
From his picnic spot on the old head of Kinsale, George Henderson remained spellbound by the sight.
She reached the stage where even the propellers had come out of the water, which weren't going round, you could see them there. And then, as if she was on a slide, she just disappeared underneath the waves.
With one last rush of steam and spray, Lusitania had been swallowed by the Atlantic in an astounding 18 minutes.
I waved goodbye, and I got into trouble for doing it. Dad scolded me for upsetting everybody, you see.
You could see all the debris and everything floating about. You could see a few lifeboats and people scrambling. You couldn't tell there were people screaming. They were too far out.
Hundreds of people went down with the sinking liner. Only 6 of the 48 lifeboats had been successfully launched. With the Irish coast in sight but out of reach, and rescue boats from Queenstown still a distant 20, the remaining passengers and crew struggled in the freezing water. Their fight for survival was only beginning. Less than 20 minutes after being torpedoed, the 30,000-ton Lusitania plunged into darkness, settling on the floor of the Irish Sea. Hundreds of people, men, women and children, went down to the bottom with her. But 300 feet above, Lusitania's survivors battled with 56-degree water and each other for survival.
The scene in the water must have been terrifying, absolutely terrifying. You have this mammoth ship rolling over basically on top of you. You have nowhere you can go, so you are clawing and scratching at people, grabbing onto things, trying to get away. Probably the most nightmarish scene you could imagine.
5-year-old Edith Lewis, along with her mother and father, had safely abandoned the doomed British liner on one of the ship's lifeboats.
We were lucky. I mean, we were one of the lucky ones. I mean, there were not that many lifeboats got away. There weren't an awful lot of people in the water. I mean, some could swim, some couldn't, and they were swimming to the lifeboats.
Drifting over 10 miles from the Irish coast in a lifeboat filled to capacity, the Lewises were surrounded by drowning multitudes that they were incapable of helping.
I remember the hands, you remember the knuckles along the side of the boat. It did upset me, but they couldn't take them on board. I remember them being pushed off, and I didn't like seeing it, but I didn't really realize the significance of it, that they were going to drown. Right? I didn't realize that.
Like the Lewises, Margaret Cox and her 17-month-old son Desmond had managed to find places in a lifeboat. But many of their fellow survivors found little solace in their salvation.
My mother in the lifeboat recalled one woman that beat her with her fists. This poor lady had lost her child right at the last. And mother understood what was happening. The woman was just frantic.
For young Edith Stanley, simply reaching the lifeboats didn't guarantee safety.
The water was coming in at the base of the boat because the plug was missing. And so this girl lay down in the bottom of the boat, over the hole, and she was holding a young child on her chest. She was very brave. She lay there till it was no longer necessary.
Among the hundreds lacking the safety of a lifeboat was Captain William T. Turner. He had been one of the last to abandon ship, being washed off the bridge as Lusitania slid beneath the waves. As Turner struggled in the freezing ocean, he muttered a prayer that his ship's SOS had been received. But with every passing minute, the bitter cold waters of the North Atlantic claimed more of the struggling survivors' lives.
This was May, but it was not, there were not warm waters. It was very possible that you'd die of exposure once you were in the water. So it was an absolute horror.
25 miles away, in the tiny Irish port of Queenstown, Lusitania's frantic SOS had been received, and naval officials hastily devised emergency plans. Over a dozen ships, consisting mainly of fishing trawlers, naval patrol and torpedo craft, assembled at the Queenstown pier to mount an impromptu rescue mission. tiny armada of rescue boats put to sea, uncertain of what they would find in that lonely spot 10 miles off the old head of Kinsale. It would be 2 hours before the first boats reached the side of Lusitania's sinking. The anguished screams and panicked cries that had earlier filled the afternoon air had faded now, with the silence only occasionally broken by distant and muffled sobs of the survivors who had made it to the lifeboats. The rescuers' first concerns were the human forms bobbing in the ocean.
By the time they got there, there really were no people left alive, and all they saw were bodies. Many of them clinging on to spars of wood, many of them wearing life belts, but all of them were dead. And you get this great sense of regret and nearly anguish that they couldn't do more. So they concentrated on trying to rescue the living.
One of the first lifeboats encountered by the rescuers was that of young Edith Lewis and her family.
You could see Ireland in the distance with the sun shining on it. The fishing boats were out. That's how people picked up our fishing boat. We were lifted on board there, and they came around with big mugs of tea, and everybody drank out of it. And I was horrified because I'd always been taught not to drink out of anybody else's cup.
In all, over 700 survivors were pulled aboard rescue craft before being ferried to Queenstown. The last arriving boats inherited the macabre task of gathering the dead. In Queenstown, it was no longer possible to hope when the rescue boats started arriving home in the early evening with their sad cargoes. The residents of this village were not prepared for the seemingly endless stream of stunned, exhausted survivors pouring in through the night. Every free building in Queenstown soon became a makeshift hospital.
Many were injured, but many others were just in considerable shock, suffering from exposure and complete disorientation. After all, they had been travelling along in a luxurious liner. Everything seemed to be fine, and within the space of a few hours they had been near death, had seen death all around them. And of course most of them were travelling with others and were very concerned as to where their relatives and friends that they were travelling with had got to.
As fishing trawlers continued to bring in the dead, the Queenstown Pier became an open-air morgue.
These rescue craft were coming in out of the darkness, looming up to the quayside, and then discharging just these still bodies. The people were laid out, and of course the main thing then was for relatives and friends to try to identify them. One lady I spoke to a number of years ago describes how she recalled seeing this woman with, I think she had long fair hair, and she had 2 children strapped to her, and they were all dead, and they were lying out, but they looked as though they were just sleeping. And it was one of the saddest things she ever remembers seeing.
The days following the sinking were quite grisly. Rewards were offered: £1 for an, quote, ordinary body, £2 for an American body, and I've heard up to £1,000 for Alfred Vanderbilt, but he was never recovered.
During his efforts to escape the sinking ship, 10-year-old Frank Hook had been separated from his sister and father and had suffered a broken leg. Recuperating in a local hospital, he prayed that he would see his family alive again. It was over a week before his plea was answered.
A man heard that there was a boy in the hospital and went and told his father, and they went to the hospital to check, and it turned around, it was Dad. Dad asked his father, why did it take so long to find him? That they had been looking all around and looking through all the drowned people to see whether he was one of the ones that had drowned or were dead.
After spending over 3 hours treading water in the freezing Atlantic, a bedraggled Captain William Turner was snatched from the waves and ferried into Queenstown. Photographed here wandering the high street, still wearing his water-soaked uniform, he seemed dazed and unable to comprehend what had befallen his Lusitania, their passengers and crew. In the coming days, with the death toll mounting, Turner would soon be thrust onto center stage in the Lusitania drama, as the grieving world clamored for a villain or a scapegoat, someone to blame for the appalling disaster. Three days after the sinking of RMS Lusitania, 5-year-old Edith Lewis and her family boarded a ferry to Liverpool with other survivors of the disaster. They were met at the docks by hysterical crowds clamoring for news of loved ones and friends.
Liverpool was teeming with people. I was frightened of the crowds because they were all around the place. Everybody was milling around looking for survivors and that sort of thing. And of course there were big billboards up with the names of the survivors. People were trying to get to them to read the name of the survivors. There weren't that many. My mother's father and stepmother and aunt were waiting for us there. And I have another vivid memory of a stranger coming up to me and giving me a teddy bear for being a brave girl. I had it for years, but it's gone now.
A throng of hungry reporters descended upon Liverpool and Queenstown, looking for every scrap of news on the disaster. Even the most cynical newsman could not help but gasp at the sight of 6 empty lifeboats docked at the Queenstown pier, all that remained of Cunard's proudest liner. Through the power of photographs, the whole world stood in solemn attendance at the mass burial in Queenstown. Images of the disaster appeared in newspapers around the world.
Reaction immediately after the sinking of the Lusitania was sheer horror. Unannounced sinkings like this had happened before, but it was with fairly small ships, fairly small loss of life. So the Lusitania was not a matter of difference, but simply degree, and it was a degree so large that the world was not really prepared for the implications of unrestricted submarine warfare.
The torpedoing and sinking of RMS Lusitania claimed the lives of over 1,200 men, women and children. Over 3/4 of the bodies were never recovered. The sensational headlines wasted no time in apportioning blame. According to the papers, responsibility for this mass murder at sea fell squarely on the shoulders of the Kaiser and U-boat commander Lieutenant Walter Schweiger.
On the last day of April, Walter Schweiger was unknown. He was an obscure guy, a small-time U-boat commander. And in only 7 days, he became the most hated man in the whole world. The German Kaiser realized it was a huge mistake and was a major propaganda blunder for Germany, as it was a great gain for Churchill.
court of world opinion, Germany had committed an unforgivable sin. Even as the bodies of the dead were committed to the Irish soil, anti-German riots erupted throughout the world. In England, enraged mobs pillaged German-owned shops and businesses. Choruses of "Kill the Kaiser" rang out in crowded city streets.
Within days, the British had seized on the sinking as a wonderful propaganda tool. It appeared on posters, billboards, leaflets, but probably the best thing was a medal that was produced in Germany by a Munich metal worker. It really wasn't to celebrate the sinking, it was to show the callousness of the Cunard Line in selling tickets to innocent civilians on what was really a blockade runner. When the British got a hold of the medal, they eventually produced 300,000 of them and passed them out worldwide. They also included a flyer, and the flyer was total anti-German propaganda, and at the bottom it said, "When you're done with this flyer, please pass it along to a friend so they can read about the new German atrocity."
Grief over the sinking of Lusitania had given way to outrage as the public demanded accountability. The cry for justice was particularly shrill in America, when the death toll revealed 128 of her citizens had been victims of the disaster. War hawk Teddy Roosevelt declared the act to be piracy on a vaster scale than any old-time pirate ever practiced. The United States ambassador in London went even further, claiming the US must declare war or forfeit European respect. From the White House, President Woodrow Wilson penned a letter of outrage to Germany. In it, Wilson reiterated his famous sermon on the right of Americans to travel with immunity upon the high seas. He demanded that Germany pay reparations to victims and cease its policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. The letter, though stern, stopped short of a declaration of war. Ever conscious of America's political climate, Wilson knew his citizens wanted justice, but the majority of them still insisted that this was not their war. The Kaiser's response to Wilson's letter expressed his nation's sorrow for the loss of innocent human lives, but steadfastly defended the German position, since Lusitania was an auxiliary cruiser on the Navy list, constructed with government funds. Cunard and Britain were solely to blame for the sinking.
In the aftermath of the disaster, Britain accused Germany of willful and wholesale murder, and Germany counter-accused that the Lusitania sank as a result of shipping a clandestine cargo of munitions which exploded from the impacting torpedo.
Though tainted by their portrayal as the cruel, bloodthirsty Huns, the Germans had some powerful evidence on their side. There were the Lusitania's cargo manifests, and the unsolved mystery of the second explosion. There was the hunger blockade, and millions of starving German citizens, as well as Churchill's blatant violations of cruiser rules on the Atlantic, encouraging U-boat captains to fire first and ask questions later. Not surprisingly, none of this evidence ever made it past the doors of Britain's Board of Trade inquiry into the sinking, headed by Admiralty Wreck Commissioner the Venerable Lord Mersey. The 74-year-old Mersey, chairman of the recent Titanic inquiry, convened the Lusitania hearings on June the 15th, 1915, in London. Over the next month, dozens of witnesses gave testimony, including Captain William Turner.
It's been said that the British inquiry into the loss of the Lusitania, which was presided over by Lord Mersey, was a whitewash. I tend to agree. I've read transcripts of the inquiry, and the thing that I find the most frustrating is when there's a witness up on the stand, and the witness is starting to expound too much, give too much information. Lord Mersey will cut him off and say, "Well, what does that have to do with anything? Move along."
The British government fully expected the patriotic Lord Mersey to disallow any information that could be harmful to the nation, and in this the Wreck Commissioner would not disappoint them. On July the 17th, Lord Mersey issued his ruling. The whole blame for the cruel destruction of life in this catastrophe, he solemnly pronounced, must rest solely with those who plotted and with those who committed the crime.
The Mersey Tribunal, or Mersey Sham would be a more appropriate word, because the trial was a whitewash. They needed to somehow disguise the second explosion, play down munitions. They claimed there was no munitions, and it was decided that 2 torpedoes were fired at the Lusitania, not 1.
The survivors of the disaster and families of victims would have to wait until April 1918 for their day in court. Lawsuits totaling nearly $6 million were filed against the Cunard Company. The case was heard by Judge Julius B. Mayer in a federal district court in New York. Like Mersey before him, Mayer conveniently dismissed evidence unfavorable to the Cunard Company and the crew of Lusitania. The plaintiffs left the proceedings empty-handed. Their case was now officially closed. But dozens of questions remained. Why did Captain Turner disobey so many of the Admiralty's instructions? Were there high explosives secretly hidden in Lusitania's cargo hold? Was there a conspiracy masterminded by Churchill to sink the ship in order to bring America into the war? The answers would linger in the depths of the Irish Sea for the next 80 years. The case was closed, the verdict typeset in black and white. The sinking of the Lusitania and the death of over 1,200 aboard her was deemed murder on the Atlantic. The killers were the bloodthirsty Huns. Yet from the very beginning, unanswered questions and intrigue surrounding the great ship's sinking haunted all connected with her. Within months of the Lusitania inquiry, the sage and seasoned Lord Mersey resigned his post as Admiralty Wreck Commissioner. It is said he later confided to a friend, "The whole Lusitania inquiry was a damned dirty business." Years later, secret government documents revealed Churchill and Admiralty officials had directed Lord Mersey to make a scapegoat of Lusitania's Captain William Turner. Despite crushing pressure, Mersey had steadfastly protected Turner, who never did give a consistent or satisfactory explanation of his failure to follow the Admiralty's directives while in the war zone.
Captain Turner was an obstinate, old-fashioned, stick-in-the-mud captain. It's hard to believe, but he just couldn't anticipate, he couldn't conceive of his ship being sunk. Unfortunately, a lot of people paid for his overconfidence, if you want to put it that way.
Criticism of Captain Turner has been superseded by the question of how many torpedoes actually struck Lusitania. The numerous witnesses testified that only 1 torpedo hit the liner. The Mersey Tribunal conveniently found that 2 torpedoes sank the ship. Why, historians continue to wonder, would the British Admiralty persist in this questionable theory when the U-20 commander himself, Lieutenant Walter Schweiger, reported that he'd only fired a single missile? Did someone have a vested interest in concealing the true cause of the second, larger explosion, the one that actually inflicted Lusitania's fatal wound?
The second explosion really is the core of the mystery of the sinking of the Lusitania. Some people have suggested that it was a boiler explosion, but there are survivors from the impacted boiler rooms, and none of them report it. Munitions can't be ruled out. They were on board. There's no physical evidence they detonated. On the other hand, there's no compelling reason to think that they didn't if they were on board. That's the wild card.
Dozens of theories have attempted to explain the massive conflagration. Contraband TNT, packed in cases deceptively marked furs, highly explosive aluminium powder, coal dust. Years after the sinking, new scenarios of the second blast are still being debated. Beneath the waves of the Irish Sea, Lusitania rests on her starboard side, hiding the true cause of the second explosion.
In 1993, I was very fortunate to be able to go down in the submarine and examine the hull myself. Nothing we had heard about the wreck was true. The hull was intact. The magazine where the munitions were supposedly stored was perfectly intact. Basically, we had to start at square one. We'll never know. It'll always remain a mystery. We can take our best guesses, but that's about all we can do.
Whatever the reason for the second explosion, if there was indeed a cover-up, who could have been its mastermind? In classified government documents, the Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill expressed a desire to turn American public opinion against the Germans. Could he have intentionally placed Lusitania and her passengers in the path of the fateful torpedo?
I think Churchill had the conspiracy to embroil the Lusitania with a German submarine and create some event that would enrage and inflame American public opinion. Churchill's grand plan backfired, and he was quite surprised by the outcome.
I have no doubt that in the privacy of his heart, Winston Churchill was hoping that if a ship sank, it would sink in such a way as to inflame American passions. But it's very different to be the master strategist that hopes for the fortunate, unfortunate happening, as opposed to deliberately setting up a vessel and leaving her abandoned in the middle of the ocean. It makes for a good story, but once you think it out, it doesn't make good sense. There's plenty of blame to go around. Turner, the Admiralty, the American government, the British government at large, of course the Germans for actually firing the torpedo. And I'm sorry to say, even the American victims who were lost, they were foreign nationals, but they were still traveling on a British ship into a known war zone.
The sinking of the Lusitania sparked an international uproar against Germany, but it was not the flashpoint that drove the United States to enter the First World War. In the months following the disaster, President Woodrow Wilson chose a diplomatic rather than a military course of action. As a result of his efforts, Wilson exacted a promise from Germany to end unrestricted submarine warfare in the Atlantic. The president's success in handling this matter was a key element in his 1916 re-election, in which Wilson's campaign motto proclaimed, "He kept us out of war." The Kaiser's pledge to end unrestricted submarine warfare lasted for 2 years. But by January of 1917, Germany was a nation on the brink of destruction.
Britain was clearly getting the upper hand, and Germany felt that they could no longer stand by this promise that was foisted on them by the United States government. They resumed unrestricted warfare. The Germans torpedoed another British ship, the Laconia, also the Cunard Line. That precipitated a major diplomatic crisis. This, coupled with the infamous Zimmerman telegram, in which Germany promised Mexico the states of Texas, Arizona, and California, if Mexico would enter the war on Germany's side, was just the straw that broke the camel's back. So Wilson arranged for a declaration of war on Germany.
Although 2 years had passed since her sinking, Lusitania was still fresh in American minds. Army recruitment posters proclaimed, "Remember the Lusitania," in bold capital letters. Fighting on the Western Front in 1918, thousands of American boys rushed over the top screaming "Lusitania" over the deafening din of shellfire. With the added muscle of fresh American forces, England and her allies quickly overran the Germans. By November of 1918, the Great War was finally over. The landscape of Europe bore visible scars of the 4-year conflict. The grim devastation drove home the true lesson of the first modern war. Mankind was capable of cruelty and destruction on a scale never before imagined.
It was a colossal change. After the Lusitania sank, the whole concept of the modern world was altered. It meant that not only war was hell for the soldier, but it was going to be hell for everybody. And so I think that is one of the biggest aftermaths of the Lusitania going down. Suddenly the curtain was pulled aside and you saw war in all its horror.
As the decades fall away, the issue of blame grows more diffuse. Just as 315 feet beneath the Irish Sea, Lusitania's hull disintegrates more every year, merging with the ocean floor where she has slept for over 80 years. The few who come to visit this dark and silent place find themselves hypnotically drawn beyond accusations and unanswered questions, towards a more universal understanding of Lusitania's tragedy.
There's almost a personal connection with the wreck. Feelings of sorrow and sadness and what occurred here, that moment in history, that we're not just reading about it on a page in a book. To see portholes, some of them open and some of them closed, just the way they were left by human hands all those years ago.
The ship took 18 minutes to sink. There was no room for heroics, no room for a legacy. And the funny thing was, it was right across the board. The wealthy, the obscure, they all died alike. It didn't make a difference.
So many people were lost and there was so much confusion. All I can do is thank God and the extreme bravery of my mother, or I wouldn't be here today.
The ship was so big that I thought it couldn't be sunk. I get very emotional. I think too much back. I start to cry. So I don't think back.
Anybody who was on it, you never forget it. I mean, you don't, what should I say, mourn over it or let it worry you now, but it's past history, but still it's always with you.
The legacy of the Lusitania lies in the very violence of her death. On the first day of May in 1915, 1,959 people boarded the finest liner in the world, unaware that in the deadly global chess match, destiny had assigned them the role of sacrificial pawns. On one quiet May afternoon off the Irish coast, destiny called checkmate, and the Lusitania earned her grim place in the history of wartime slaughter.
History Showcase features Napoleon and Wellington next week at the same time.